I'm reading a book currently called A New Earth. I believe it's called by Eckhart Tolle. And it's a book about, I guess if I had to summarize it, and I'm only maybe about halfway through, a little bit less than halfway through. So just kind of doing a review up to this point. But if I had to categorize it, it's kind of a book about how to find or how to achieve kind of a spiritual awakening of really opening your mind and understanding who you are, what role like your ego plays in driving your life, but how to detach from that and live kind of a more true, honest and fulfilled life. Again, detach yourself from your mind and understand that you are not your thoughts is kind of a key principle of it. And that there's kind of a greater spirituality and force across the universe and kind of the connectedness of people. And that's really what you need to tap into. And you need to have, in theory, you need to have this awakening to have that happen. And I'm reading the book partially because it was recommended to me by somebody. So I respect the person, want to read it, want to see what it's about. And I always look for inputs and new books to read, but particularly ones that are not directly in line with how I normally think. So spiritual awakening is not something that I would normally, consider that I focus on or talk about or really, I guess, subscribe to, if you would. But for that reason, it's interesting to me because I want to see. I want to see something different. I want to challenge my thoughts. I want to see if there's something to it. More information, always good. And my first reaction to the book is actually that there's a lot of overlap between what I talk about in these videos and what's in the book. Very different language, very different way of looking at it, very different approach to it. Even like a difference in like the underlying principles of like how you achieve it and how you get there. But what it is, right, at its core, I think it's very, very similar. The idea of opening your mind, being more of control of your mind and who you are, having more of a deeper truth of yourself and understanding of yourself, not letting your mind control you, as we would talk about with kind of blind spots and biases and even ego being a big part of it and identity driving a lot of that. So there is actually a lot of overlap. And I think that makes sense. And it's possible that there's just different entry points or mechanisms or approaches for people to see that. And who's to say if mine's right or theirs is right or what have you. But a few of the things I guess that came up that made me question a little, probably even made me a little bit defensive, if I'm being honest, just naturally, but I'm trying to work through that obviously. One was around the idea that that you can't think your way into the consciousness and the awakening that is spoken about in the book. It's not something your conscious mind could just process and think through and get to. In the book, they talk about it at times somewhat of there's got to be some sort of trigger, like an adversity or a deeply traumatic event that kind of strips you away from your ego or your possessions or whatever it might be, and it allows you to have that awakening. And in some aspects, they talk about it more as just kind of a spiritual phenomenon that happens. And it's something that, again, it's like a near-death experience, things like that are really what drive it. It's epiphany kind of ahas that come from the universe, I guess, and that you don't think your way into it. And that's naturally challenging for me because I subscribe to a theory, at least right now, that thinking is the key. That's the goal, right? You want to think. You want to understand the logic behind our thoughts, behind what's happening, the deep, true, kind of objective truth logic of it. You want to face the inconvenient truths that you might have in yourself. You want to get in the mud, as I often say, and kind of really check your thoughts and understand what you're thinking. So it's similar in that you don't want your thoughts to just happen and you not understand them and not be honest with yourself and not be aware of the flaws of how the mind works and all that stuff. So you don't want to just let your thoughts run free. But in one case, it's saying, you have to eliminate those thoughts almost. Not completely, but to get to where you want to get to, it's in spite of those thoughts, right? You need to figure out how to detach and work around them. Whereas in the way I would talk about it, it's much more that you need to harness those thoughts. You need to find the right process, the right approach the right methodology to think in a way that allows you to harness the power of your mind in the right direction and get to those answers, those truths you want to get to. They're not just magic epiphanies that come from the universe. They're not only triggered by, deeply traumatic or life or death experiences that kind of awaken you in some way. They come from thought. They come from working through and understanding, what's at play. Now, again, I'm not naive or arrogant enough to think my answer is the only answer and it's right and it's better than that answer. Honestly, I can really only speak for myself. And it's possible even in that I'm missing something, and that spirituality approach is actually what is at play. And if it were, it sounds maybe like a cop-out, I would say, well, then there's a logic to that. That's the way that it works. There must be, right? You figure that out. But again, it's just based on the evidence and the information that I see. And that's all I can do is base decisions and views on that. Based on what I see and know, it would appear to me as if that underlying logic principle is really the crux of it. And that you can think your way through these things. You can and you have to. That's really the true way to do it. Otherwise, it risks being too superficial. It risks being something that is more of a true leap of faith that hasn't actually addressed any issues you have, right? As I say to my son all the time, and I say in these videos, you have to be able to explain why. And if you can't explain why, I just don't believe that you've gotten there yet. The way that our minds work, at least how I understand it from a more scientific, physiological perspective, we are too flawed. The mind is too flawed in how it functions, to where if you allow ambiguity, if you allow uncertainty and doubt in terms of what the logic is of the actions you're taking, right? Doubt in terms of changing your views, changing your opinions, I think is okay. But if you don't understand why you're even doing what you're doing in the moment, it's very hard to believe that you can, have this awakening, right? And you can, as they would word it, or have this open mind where you have better perspective on everything. To me, better perspective means you have more information. It means you understand it better. So it's hard for me to wrap my arms around a principle that really defies that and says, no, you could never get there that way. That's difficult for me. So it's something that I'm trying to think through in the book and kind of try and make sense of it and how it plays out. And, I think there's some other areas of it that I struggle with a little bit. The certainty piece of it is one, as I just mentioned, the idea that thinking will never get you there. That seems too certain for me, right? As I would say for me, I think thinking gets me there, but I could be wrong. For other people, spirituality and the approach that they speak of in the book, maybe that's it for them. That's the language they speak. That's, there's some other aspect of it that I don't understand yet that makes that true or work for them. I'm open to that idea. I don't know. I couldn't say it with certainty, but to have it being said with certainty in the book, for me, it takes a hit to the credibility of it. Because as you know, certainty in something like that, how could you be so certain? How do you know that's true? Particularly in the way that you're presenting it. There's almost inherently in it a leap of faith logic to it, right? A leap of faith of it just happens and it's part of the spirituality that we can't fully understand. Well, by definition then, if you can't fully understand it, you can't be sure. So the certainty I worry about a little bit when it comes to that. And then there's also just some specific examples that I think I look at and I see logic in, and it's being presented as if there's not logic there. And again, why are we so quick to dismiss that, I guess, in the book would be my question. Example, in the book, as I mentioned, they talk about to have this awakening, I think almost always the way they present it, it has to come from some kind of deep adversity or tragedy or catastrophic almost event in your life. And at one point they talk about it as, we are so tied to our ego and identifying with possessions and kind of who we are and who we tell the world we are, that one of the only ways to have this awakening is if you hit kind of rock bottom, if something tragic happens and everything's stripped away from you. And, your identity doesn't mean anything anymore, and maybe you've lost a family or your livelihood, right? You lost your house, you lost, everything, you're living on the street type thing. At that point, you're almost forced into the awakening because everything's been stripped away. And you start to recognize that's not who I am. I'm something more than that. And the way that manifests out is you start to live kind of your truth. You start to live a truer, more fulfilled life. You go after the things you actually want. You don't worry about the things that aren't as important, like maybe some of those material possessions. And again, I understand what they're saying. Where I question is the idea that it is not a logical process that's happening. Again, the way I think about logic, the suggestion that it's more of a spiritual phenomenon, that when you get to that bottom place, all of a sudden you have this epiphany, kind of magic aha. To me, I would bring it back to what I often bring it back to, which is math and cost-benefit analysis, right? If you think about the average person, myself is a good example. Right now, when I think about my life and how I live it, and am I living it, in a truly awakened way, as they would say in the book? Am I truly just going after what my truth is and what I think my purpose is in life? Well, no, right? I think of it through a cost-benefit calculation, and there's cost to that, right? I have a job. Assuming I don't love that job, I would have to leave it. That would put my family at risk, my mortgage payment, lots of things, lots of risks. There's lots of fear of horrible things that can happen where I can't take care of my family anymore, right? As a key example of it. So when I run that cost-benefit analysis, I end up erring on the side, at least as of now, of being cautious and not, taking that leap. If I were to lose everything, if I were to lose my job and lose my house, and now, or God forbid, lose a family member or lose my family, well, I don't think there's a magical spiritual awakening that happens there. I think the math of that equation changes. The fear that was pent up in the cost side of the equation previously that prevented me from acting differently is now gone. It happened. It was realized, which is obviously horrific, whatever it might be. But now in the new moment, right, the moment right after that, when I run my cost-benefit analysis, well, now that cost isn't there anymore. It's a sunk cost. It's gone. So now when I'm running it, there's almost nothing to lose, right? In the cliched saying, there's no risk. There's no cost to it. It's all potential upside. It can only go up from here. So why not take these actions? So just an example where, from my perspective, I still see a deep logic in that, a kind of mathematical level logic where it's happening the way it's supposed to happen. You can trace it back to something that explains it. It's not an unexplainable phenomenon. It's thinking through it. Now, sometimes we run those calculations in our subconscious, or we don't actively think through it. We just let our minds go. And I would totally agree with the book in the thought that that's not the best approach, because it may go the way you want, it may not. You're not in control of it. You want to be in control of it. Where I would differ, at least up to this point, and let's see as I keep reading the book and as I keep thinking about it, kind of challenging my thoughts, to me, I still see the logic in it. I still see the logic playing the key role of how you control your mind, how you get to that better place, how you get more open-minded and kind of seeking objective truth.